On the 22nd of December, 1849, Fyodor Dostoyevsky was led to a public square in St. Petersburg, tied to a post and blindfolded. The death sentence was read aloud. The firing squad raised their rifles. He was 28 years old. He had written 2 novels. He believed he was about to die. A rider arrived at the last moment with a reprieve from the Tsar. The execution was a staged mock, a punishment designed to terrorize rather than kill. Several men in the square that day lost their minds permanently from the experience. Dostoyevsky did not. He was sent instead to 4 years of hard labor in a Siberian prison camp, followed by years of forced military service in exile. What came out of that experience, out of the mock execution and the camp and the epilepsy and the gambling addiction and the poverty and the losses that followed, was some of the most luminous writing about human dignity and the meaning of suffering ever produced. Tonight we ask why. What Dostoyevsky found in the darkness that he could not have found anywhere else. And what it means for how you think about your own. In 1849, he got involved with a circle of intellectuals who were reading banned political literature. Fourier, French utopian socialism, ideas about the reorganization of society that the Tsar considered deeply threatening. He was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to death. The mock execution that followed was designed to break something in him. In the men around him it often did. What it broke in Dostoyevsky was his relationship to abstract ideas about humanity. Before his arrest, he had been, in the manner of many young Russian intellectuals of his era, a rationalist and a progressive, a believer in the improvability of human beings through better social arrangements, the kind of person who thinks about humanity in aggregate, in systems and classes and historical forces, rather than in the specific, suffering, irreducible individual in front of them. The prison camp ended that. 4 years among murderers and thieves and peasants, people whom the progressive intellectual circles of St. Petersburg would have categorized and moved past, people Dostoyevsky was now sleeping beside, eating with, enduring the cold with. What he found was not the abstraction he had theorized about. It was something that resisted every theory he had brought with him. Human beings, encountered directly, are not improvable in the ways that rational systems imagine. They are not primarily rational. They are contradictory, irrational, capable of extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary tenderness, often in the same person, driven by forces that no utilitarian calculus can fully account for. They suffer in ways that make neat philosophical consolation ring hollow, and they endure in ways that make neat philosophical despair ring equally hollow. The prison camp gave Dostoyevsky his subject. The rest of his life was spent trying to do justice to what he had seen there. He returned from Siberia a different writer. The rationalist optimism was gone. In its place was something more difficult and more honest, a willingness to look directly at the worst of human experience without flinching away from it, combined with an absolute refusal to conclude from that experience that human beings were without dignity, or that suffering was without meaning. He wrote Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, Demons, The Brothers Karamazov, each one a different angle on the same enormous question. What does it mean to be human in a world where suffering is real and unavoidable and distributed with apparent randomness? What remains when everything else has been stripped away? Is there something in the human being that cannot be destroyed, even by the worst the world can do? His answer, worked out across 40 years of writing, was yes. But not a comfortable yes. A yes that had looked at the no and refused to accept it, not from naivety, but from something that had been tested by fire. The central insight that Dostoyevsky kept returning to, in different forms, through different characters in different novels, is that suffering is not simply something that happens to human beings from outside. It is something that happens inside them, generated partly by their own nature, and that cannot be eliminated by improving their external conditions. This put him in direct opposition to the dominant intellectual current of his aura. The rationalists and the socialists and the utopians all believed that human suffering was primarily the product of unjust social arrangements: poverty, inequality, poor education, bad institutions. Fix the institutions, and you fix the human being. Create the right conditions, and suffering will diminish to manageable levels. Dostoyevsky had watched this theory fail in real time, not because the institutions were fine, they were not, but because the human beings inside them were more complicated than the theory allowed for. Because suffering went deeper than circumstance. Because the impulse toward self-destruction, toward cruelty, toward the assertion of individual will, even against one's own interests, these were not products of poverty or ignorance. They were features of human consciousness itself. In Notes from Underground, written after his return from Siberia, he created one of literature's first anti-heroes, the underground man. A bitter, self-aware, deeply unpleasant narrator who tears apart the rationalist dream of human perfectibility from the inside, who argues that human beings will always resist being reduced to predictable rational actors, that they will choose irrationality, self-harm, and spite simply to assert that they are more than a cog in someone else's optimized machine. Twice two makes four. Yes, of course, the underground man says, but twice two makes five is sometimes also a very charming little thing. The point is not that suffering is good. The point is that the human need to assert freedom, even destructively, even against one's own interests, is real and will not be engineered away. That any vision of human improvement which does not account for this dimension of human nature is building on a foundation that will eventually crack. But Dostoyevsky's answer to suffering was not simply to expose the naivety of those who thought it could be eliminated. He had something more to say, something that came from the deepest part of his experience. Suffering, in his understanding, was the primary condition under which certain kinds of human growth become possible. Not all suffering, not suffering imposed by injustice or cruelty, which he condemned with fury, but the suffering that comes from genuinely engaging with the full weight of existence, from loving people who can be lost, from caring about things that can fail, from being present to the actual texture of a human life rather than retreating into abstraction or comfort. The characters in his novels who are most fully alive are almost universally the ones who have suffered most. Not because suffering is secretly pleasant, because suffering, met with open eyes, and without the consolation of easy answers, produces a depth of humanity that the protected and the comfortable almost never develop. Prince Mishkin in The Idiot, Alyosha Karamazov in The Brothers Karamazov. These are not triumphant figures in the conventional sense. They are people who have been broken open by the world and found, in that opening, something that the unbroken cannot access. A capacity for compassion so wide it has no edges. A presence so complete it changes the people around them simply by existing. The Brothers Karamazov, his final novel, completed just before his death in 1881, contains what many consider the most devastating challenge to religious faith ever written, and the most moving response to it in the same book. Ivan Karamazov, the intellectual brother, the rationalist, presents his argument against God not through abstract philosophy, but through a collection of stories about the suffering of children. Real cases. Children tortured by adults. Children killed for sport. He is not arguing that God doesn't exist. He is arguing that even if God exists, the suffering of innocent children is a price he refuses to pay for any cosmic harmony. He hands back the ticket. He will not accept a universe where such things are the cost of the greater good. It is one of the most powerful passages in literature. Dostoyevsky, who believed in God, who had found faith in the prison camp, does not answer it with a counter-argument. He answers it with a person, Alyosha, the younger brother, who listens to Ivan's devastating case and does not refute it, who cannot refute it, and who lives in response to it with such complete and unconditional love for the people around him that the argument somehow loses its power, not because it has been answered, but because it has been transcended. Dostoyevsky was not saying that suffering is fine. He never said that. He said something harder and more honest, that suffering is real and often unjust and cannot be philosophically justified, and that the appropriate response to it is not an argument, but a life lived with the fullness of presence that suffering, paradoxically, makes available to those who do not run from it. He knew this from experience in a way that most philosophers do not. The mock execution, the prison camp, the epilepsy that could strike without warning and leave him humiliated and disoriented, the gambling addiction that destroyed his finances repeatedly, the deaths of people he loved. None of this was abstract for him. He was not theorizing about suffering from a comfortable study. He was writing from inside it, every day, for most of his life. And what he found, not as a consolation but as a fact, was that the suffering did not prevent the luminosity, that somehow the two coexisted, that the same life that contained the prison camp and the epilepsy and the poverty also contained the writing of the brothers Karamazov. That whatever was in him that could produce that, the compassion, the insight, the capacity to render human beings with such completeness that readers a century and a half later feel genuinely seen by fictional characters, was not separate from the suffering, was in some way he never fully explained, made possible by it. He died in 1881 at the age of 59. In the days before his death, people came from across Russia to visit him. Students, writers, ordinary people who had found in his work something they could not find elsewhere. The sense of being fully seen in their suffering, of having someone acknowledge, without minimizing or resolving, the full weight of what it costs to be human. There is a line from the brothers Karamazov that has stayed with readers for 140 years. Love the life God gave you. Do not love others' lives. Do not love the ideal of life more than life itself. Not the life you wish you had. Not the life you are planning to live once conditions improve. Not the abstract idea of a life worth living. This life, the one that contains the suffering and the confusion and the things you would not have chosen and the beauty that exists alongside all of it. That is what Dostoyevsky found in the dark. Not that suffering is secretly good, that it is real, and that the life which contains it is still worth the full force of your love. He could not have written that from anywhere else. Neither can you live it from anywhere else, only from exactly where you are.